So, if you've been told that any screen time will damage your child's brain, you've been lied to. I'm going to show you exactly why this oversimplified myth is not only wrong, it might actually be harming your child's development. Hi, I'm Bee from Munamind, and today we're talking about the science that completely changes how we should think about kids and screens. Look, it's 2025 and you're still being told that screens are the enemy. That if your kid watches more than 2 hours of anything digital, their brain will turn to mush. Does this sound familiar to anyone else? I see parents everywhere living in constant guilt and anxiety, literally sneaking their kids' screen time like it's some kind of contraband, while at the same time trying to navigate a world where technology isn't going anywhere. We're literally teaching our children that technology is something to fear rather than a tool to master. And you know what? This black and white thinking about screens actually makes perfect sense because it's literally how our brains are wired for survival. We love putting things into neat little categories: good versus bad, safe versus dangerous, screen time versus no screen time. It makes us feel in control, I guess. But the reality is so much messier and also more nuanced than these fear-mongering headlines want you to believe. I want to completely flip everything you thought you knew about children and screens, because the real story is way more complex and honestly, way more hopeful than what you've been hearing. So let's go back a while back. Let's go back to 20 to 30 years ago and look at what was actually happening. We started seeing this dramatic spike in developmental diagnosis, such as ADHD rates jumping from 3% in the 1990s to over 10% today. Autism spectrum disorder diagnosis increased by like 300% between 2000 and 2014, according to the CDC. Learning disabilities, sensory processing issues, everything was trending upward. Now, what else was happening during this exact same time period? The tech boom. Personal computers became common, then smartphones, then tablets started showing up everywhere. So you have these two things happening at once, and researchers started noticing connections. Studies from this period, including some really influential work by Dmitry Christakis in 2004, showed clear correlations between excessive screen exposure and attention problems. And these weren't bad studies, they were important findings that absolutely needed attention. But then something understandable happened. The media, parenting experts, and well-meaning organizations took these correlations and started presenting them as much more straightforward than they actually were. Suddenly, screens became this thing to fear. You started seeing headlines like "Screen time will melt your child's brain," and parenting forums filled with panic about any technology use. The message became really black and white. Screens bad, no screens good. But that's not how science works, and it's definitely not how child development works. So what they didn't tell you is that while excessive screen exposure absolutely can have negative effects on children's development, it's not just about the amount of exposure. The research showing harm was real and important, but what got lost in translation was the nuance of how screens were being used, not just how much. Think about what else was happening during the same 20 to 30-year period. We have massive changes in family structure, kids were getting way less outdoor playtime, there was increased academic pressure starting earlier and earlier, we were dealing with environmental toxins, changes in diet, and honestly, we finally had better diagnostic tools that allowed us to identify neurodivergent children who had been overlooked for decades. But I think focusing solely on screens was so much easier. It gave parents something concrete to control in this increasingly overwhelming world. Fast forward to today, and the research has evolved in really fascinating ways. A 2023 systematic review published in the Journal of Pediatric Psychology found that the quality of screen content and the context of how it's used were way better predictors of developmental outcomes than just counting total screen time. Dr. Alan Selke from the University of Michigan said something that really stuck with me. It's not about whether children use screens, it's about how they use them and what support they have while using them. So the difference between passive consumption and active engagement is literally night and day for developing brains. And when I understood this, everything changed about how I think about technology and kids. Okay, so let me break this down with actual brain science, not just scary headlines. When a child sits passively in front of a screen, just mindlessly watching repetitive content with zero interaction, their brain goes into what researchers call default mode. What does default mode mean? There's minimal neural firing, very limited executive function activation. This actually is problematic for developing brains, so the concern isn't completely wrong. But when that same child uses the screen to video call their grandparents or solve problems in an educational game or create digital art while talking about it with you, it's completely different neural activity happening. The prefrontal cortex lights up. Mirror neurons start firing, language centers activate, everything is going on inside that little brain. There was this really fascinating study from the University of Washington in 2022 that tracked 1,200 children for 5 years. They found the children who engaged in what they called joint media engagement, which is basically using screens with their caregivers, actually showed improved language development, better social skills, and stronger emotional regulation compared to children with no screen time at all. That completely flipped the narrative for me. Dr. Reed Larson has done incredible research on active media use versus passive media consumption. And his findings show that children who create, interact, and engage with digital content develop stronger problem-solving skills and better creative markers than their screen-free peers. The key difference? Adults really do make the difference. Adult involvement and intentional engagement. It's not about the screen, it's about the relationship and the intention behind how you're using it. So, what does this actually mean for your family? It means we can throw out the timer and throw out the guilt, and instead start asking way better questions. Is my child actively engaged, or are they just zoned out? Are we interacting together, or am I basically using this as a babysitting tool? Is this content sparking conversation and curiosity? And honestly, am I modeling healthy technology relationships myself? Because nobody wants to admit this, but your children are going to live in a digital world, whether any of us like it or not. They're going to need to navigate virtual reality, artificial intelligence, and technologies that don't even exist yet. Teaching them to fear technology is kind of like teaching someone to fear literacy back in the 1800s. It's not preparing them for success. It's actually setting them up for anxiety and feeling incompetent in their own world. So what we really need to model is intentional, engaged, purposeful technology use. Show them that screens are tools for connection, creation, and learning, not just entertainment or escape. When you sit down with your 4-year-old to explore the solar system on an iPad, and you're discussing what you're seeing together, asking questions, making connections to books you've read, that's not really screen time. That's education, that's bonding, that's preparation for the future. The quality of the interaction matters so much more than the quantity of minutes. Look, the bottom line is this. Stop counting minutes and start paying attention to moments. Your child's development isn't determined by whether they had 30 minutes or 3 hours of screen time today. It's determined by the quality of interactions, the richness of content, and whether you're actively involved in their digital experience. So if you take anything away from this video, it should be technology isn't the enemy. Passive parenting is. If this completely changed the way you think about your family's technology use, please hit that subscribe button because we're just getting started. And I want to hear from you. What's one way you could turn passive screen time into active engagement in your house this week? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you next week. Bye.